Oh, I think that's critical. It's a great question. And that was actually the first thing I did when I came to Uber and started the growth team. I said to our team of 5 people, we've got to come up with a North Star metric. At Facebook, that North Star metric was monthly active users. And these days, different people have written blogs about growth. I know Andrew Chen used to write a blog on growth that had a lot of good stuff on it. You mentioned you were just reading the book Viral Loop. I think that's got good stuff in it as well. So there is stuff out there that's written about it, but I still think the best way to learn is just to
My name is Kevin David. You want freedom for yourself and your loved ones. The time is now.
I will be there. I will be there to help you every step of the way.
What is up, guys, and welcome back to your favorite podcast, or soon-to-be favorite podcast, The Kevin David Experience. Today we have a very exciting guest, but before we actually get into that, I wanted to thank all of you guys who've been listening to the podcast, who've been sharing the podcast, and those of you who've actually been leaving reviews on iTunes. I know it's easy, but it actually does mean a lot to us when you guys do that. And we just launched the new YouTube channel for the podcast, so make sure you check out The Kevin David Experience on YouTube as well. So big warm welcome for the KDE crew to Ed Baker, who's joining us, who has an unbelievable work history, like with some of the craziest companies that I've ever heard. So I'm personally incredibly excited to go over this one. And Ed, the first question we ask everybody on the podcast is to kind of describe your entrepreneurial journey up to right now in 60 seconds or less.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. And let's see if I can put 2 decades into 60 seconds. I'll start with when I was in college, I built my first website. It was called datesite.com. It's a crush site, so you put an email address of people that had a crush on each other. Launched it on Valentine's Day of 1999, and within a week it went viral, and a quarter of all students at Harvard signed up for it.
Nice.
I was studying physics at the time, really interested in the mathematics behind that viral growth, and that's what led me to then build a framework I used to grow things on the internet, which I used at my own startup called friend.ly, which grew to 25 million users, which I then sold to Facebook. At Facebook, I headed up the international growth team. Then I left Facebook to join Uber and start up their growth team back when it was a small startup many people hadn't yet heard of. I was there for about 4 years and then moved back to the East Coast where I live now, investing in startups, and advising them on growth, largely in the health and wellness space, companies like Whoop and Zwift and several others.
That's
I don't
incredible.
know if that was 60 seconds.
Yeah, no, that was actually perfect. And the crazy thing is, I didn't hear what the name of the startup you said you started in 99 was, but I was just reading a book, and it was talking about crushlink.com. Is that what you said?
You know, it's funny, my close friends of mine at Harvard who were classmates started Crushlink.
Oh, okay.
Shortly after I started Datesite. So
oh, wow.
We were kind of, yeah. We were all studying physics at the same time. They also moved out to Silicon Valley, and they remain very close friends of mine today.
Yeah, that's so funny because I was reading a book called, I think it's called Viral Loops. I forget what it's called, but
yes.
They were talking about like R-naught and Crushlink and a couple other. That's so funny. Like it's such a small world. And talking to you today, I was literally reading it this morning.
It's funny you mentioned R-naught. I was just messaging today with one of their founders, who's also a friend of mine.
Yeah, and which is so funny too, because like their story is so crazy because they couldn't afford like the machines to like keep it live, and so they kind of like made a deal with Rackspace to like kind of broadcast that they were using Rackspace for free processing, and like they were kind of just it's just so strange to me, like reading about the early days of these, like, you know, not necessarily hot or not, but like Yahoo. Like there was a story in a book I was reading yesterday where they were like conducting sales meetings by candlelight because like all the electricity went out in their building and there was like leaks through the ceiling. It's just people see these companies and they think it's like they're so well put together. But like, in your opinion, are startups like, how are these big mega corporations now? Do they all start so crazy and scrappy, or do some of them have like more structure, in your opinion?
You know, I think the best ones actually tend to be the scrappiest on day one. You know, Mark Zuckerberg talks about how he wasn't trying to start a company when he started Facebook. You know, he was just building a website at Harvard that was better than the paper Facebook we used to have, where you'd see everyone's high school photos. And he's like, why don't we have something online where people can upload more recent photos and things like that? So, you know, I think, and with Uber, Travis and Garrett, the co-founders, they weren't necessarily thinking it was going to turn into some huge business. They just thought, hey, this is a less expensive way to get a private driver. We can all kind of share a private driver and build a simple iPhone app that lets us press a button and tell him to pick me up, and then later that day you can press the button and he can pick you up.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're like, actually now we need a few more drivers because there are too many of us for this one driver. So a lot of times, these startups just kind of is people solving problems, not necessarily thinking of them as becoming multi-billion-dollar companies, but if it has that product market fit, it just kind of goes into that hyper growth, trajectory.
How important do you think it is, like, kind of creating like a single unifying metric? And because I've read a lot about you, which is kind of an awkward thing to say, but it's just the truth. But like one of the things I liked was kind of with Uber, there is, but like not obviously is there like a single unifying metric to track growth, right? Because there's the number of drivers, there's the number of sellers, and with like marketplaces, so to speak, right, you kind of have to say the average number of rides per day because that encompasses both the driver and the seller. Like, how important do you think that is for people who are trying to track all these different KPIs to like really focus down to like the top like 3, or do you think that that's important?
Oh, I think that's critical. It's a great question. And that was actually the first thing I did when I came to Uber and started the growth team. I said to our team of 5 people, we've got to come up with a North Star metric. At Facebook, that North Star metric was monthly active users, and later became daily active users after we crossed 1 billion monthly active users. But to your point, at a place like Uber, where you have a 2-sided marketplace with both riders and drivers, it didn't make sense to have the North Star metric be active riders or active drivers.
Right.
So we ultimately landed on weekly trips because that trip encapsulates both sides of the marketplace.
Yeah.
But I think having that North Star metric is critical because it helps align the entire team around this is the number that we've got to be focused on growing. And I'd often say to my team, if you're not working on something that's causing that number to go up, you're probably not working on the most important thing that you should be working on.
Yeah, and so like it must be so strange having like every company in the world want to hire you, which is like something that like you probably wouldn't say because you're like a nice humble guy, but like every company must want to hire you. Does that get annoying?
Well, not too many companies have tried to hire me recently, but I think that's because I'm now these days just kind of investing in startups, and what I do enjoy doing is working closely with the companies that I invest in.
Right.
So I'm kind of probably not going to dive into anything on a full-time basis again anytime soon, if ever. But I found with growth, because I've been doing this for 20 years, I can actually add a lot of value in a relatively small amount of time, just kind of pattern matching with things I've seen over the past 2 decades.
Yeah, no. And so for people who like don't understand, because I guess I do because I've read so much of your stuff and about you, but like what is a growth team, right? To people who've like aren't immersed in that like you are.
Sure. I'd say at a high level, the mission of the growth team is to take that North Star metric we were just talking about and grow it as quickly as possible. And so we would, once we figured out what our North Star metric was, we would always set goals for this is where we want to be by the end of June, this is where we want to be by the end of December, kind of set those 6-month goals.
Right.
And then do everything we could think of doing to grow that quickly or even faster. And a lot of times it was a cross-functional thing with product, marketing, engineering, design, analytics. So the growth team was always cross-functional in that way.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna ask. Like, what is like the composition, or is there like what's the composition that you kind of found to work the best? Is it like one representative from the different departments? Because if a company's too small, they probably don't have all those departments, right? So like, when is the right time to create a growth team, and what does the composition of that growth team look like?
Sure, good question. Different companies do it in different ways. I built Uber's growth team largely modeled after how the growth team at Facebook worked. So it was cross-functional, and on day one, I mentioned it was 5 people. And we didn't have departments, but we had, one person who was doing marketing, one person who was doing design, one person who was doing engineering.
Yeah.
So they weren't departments, they were just individuals. And in fact, the woman who started our growth marketing team, she had never done marketing before in her life. She had a finance background, but she was, and we were talking about scrappy startups. I think in the early days of startups, people that can wear multiple hats and just get scrappy and learn new things are the ones that often end up succeeding the most. So she dug in and learned how to do Facebook ads and all of that kind of stuff. And over time, we built out that team and hired more experienced leaders. But on day one, it's just you got to work with the team you have.
Right. And so, I mean, this is a difficult question, obviously, but like, you can't study growth, at least not like formally, or that I've ever heard of, right? So like, is there any nuance that you've picked up over the years, or like anecdotes or things that you might think would be helpful? Like, how do you identify someone that it's basically impossible to have formal training for, that is ultimately going to turn into like an above average member of a growth team, right? I mean, aside from just having direct experience growth somewhere else, everyone has to start somewhere, right? So are there any nuances that you found make somebody potentially a better fit than others?
Totally. I'd say the first thing I look for is growth really is a combination of an art and a science. I used to think it was all about the math and the science. Back in the early days of DateSite, when I was figuring out the formula for the K factor and all of that stuff, these days I actually think the art is actually the harder part. And because so much of it is about psychology and what motivates people and that kind of thing. So I'd say you can't just do one or the other. You've got to understand the math and the metrics and how to calculate things like the K factor, how to run A/B tests and understand significance and that kind of thing. But almost the harder part is coming up with the creative ideas that will actually move the metrics.
Right.
And so someone who can do both, I find those types of people tend to excel at growth.
Right.
But like you were saying, having that growth experience at another company, I think can be really helpful. Just like my experience at Facebook helped me build the growth team at Uber.
So yeah, and I mean those are great points. So I mean, like having read a significant amount about this field, like, there was like the Hotmail signature, the famous Hotmail signature, like powered by Hotmail, right? There was like the famous kind of like Zynga usage of Facebook notifications. There's kind of the address book thing that LinkedIn is famous for. Have you seen anything in recent times, or do you foresee any trends similar to those? And I hate to like go after kind of like the low hanging hacks when like that's probably not like overall the long term strategy you should take. But like, what are your opinions about those things and how to find them? And have you seen any recently that you think could be interesting?
Sure. A lot of times the viral channels change over time and often change pretty quickly. One thing that might work, 1 year, the next year, no longer does. So I like to actually focus just on higher level, like what are the creative ideas that get people to actually share more, get people interested and hook them in. But to your point of things that have worked recently, I don't know. I think, I know Clubhouse has been talked about a lot. I think they've been doing some interesting things with the mobile address book, where that you can see other people who aren't yet on Clubhouse, but how many of their friends are on. And I think that's a clever way to get people to invite, people that already have a lot of connections in an app. So I think the mobile address book still has a lot of potential as a viral channel.
Yeah, and then like, so for people who, aside from like books, I mean, because to me, it's kind of like, my mentality has always been like, look at the best, right? Like Airbnb, like they have these huge teams of like UX, UI designers who spend, years basically like A/B testing everything down to like the minutia, right? If somebody's listening to this and they want to learn more about like growth hacking or whatever you want to call it, like how would you approach that as like a beginner? Would you just go and literally sign up for Facebook, or like what's the best way to kind of get that experience aside from literally just going and interacting with the biggest people?
Sure. I actually think what you just said is a great way to learn about best practices. Is like, look at what are the products out there that have the most users and go through their sign-up flows. And the ones that have done it the best, have kind of figured out the types of things that work. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. That said, there are also resources online these days. Different people have written blogs about growth. I know Andrew Chen used to write a blog on growth that had a lot of good stuff on it. You mentioned you were just reading the book Viral Loop. I think that's got good stuff in it as well. So there is stuff out there that's written about it, but I still think the best way to learn is just to look at the other products and companies out there that are doing it well and learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And like for people out there, right, it's as easy as signing up for free apps, right? But you do it through a different lens, right? Instead of just being a true user, you're kind of like a researcher, right? And you're looking at it through a different light.
100%. And what I like to think about is, how do you minimize friction? How do you remove barriers between hearing about a product for the first time and using it? Right. And when I say hearing about it, it could be that you literally hear about it, or it could be you get an email about it or a text message about it, or you see an ad. But from that first impression you have to say, oh, I want to give this a try, what are the friction points, and how do you just remove as much friction as possible? So much of growth is about just removing that friction.
And do you think
so when you sign up for these other products, think about, have they removed friction, or is there friction in the sign-up process, and what is it, and how could I build something that doesn't have that friction?
How important do you think the number, because we do a lot of digital marketing and e-commerce, and most of our traffic comes through paid, right? So to us, we live in a very different world where we focus on putting $1 in and getting $2 out, right? But the world of the Ubers and the Facebooks is about word of mouth for the most part, growing virally. Of course, they add paid media and things like that later on, but for the most part, they grow in a very different way. And so what are your thoughts on paid media and when to start it, and whether do you do it and you lose money? What are your thoughts on paid acquisition?
Sure. At Uber, we did more paid acquisition than we did at Facebook. At Facebook, we did very little of it. But the way I look at it is, if you have a lifetime value for your average customer, you should be willing to spend some portion of that lifetime value to acquire them. So as the simple unit economics are, your LTv should be greater than your CAC. And you kind of can look at over time, how many months does it get to break even? And then after that, you can kind of make more money on top of that. At Friendly, it was all, the startup I sold to Facebook, it was all kind of free virality. We never did any paid marketing. But it also helps to mix the two. So even if you have a business where you're paying for customers and you're putting $1 in and getting $2 out, it can be helpful to add a little bit of virality to that, even if it's not so much that it grows exponentially without paid marketing. What it can do is, instead of giving you $2, put in one, get 2 out, it can be like put in one, get 4 out. Right. So that extra kind of word of mouth virality can basically just give you an even bigger return on your investment.
And you make it sound easy, right? But it's actually quite hard to calculate LTV, right? And for people listening that don't know what LTV means, it means the lifetime value of a customer. Over time, and I know this obviously it's different for different companies, but how do you approach actually calculating things like LTV and calculating things like the viral coefficient, right? Because it's easy to say, but it's much harder to calculate, in my experience.
Sure, yeah, and it's especially difficult for companies like Uber, where you have a two-sided marketplace, and do you assign an LTV to the riders and a separate LTV to the drivers? But in a lot of businesses where you just have one customer you're focused on, what you're really looking at is how much revenue is that customer bringing in over kind of their lifetime. But I like to look at it kind of over the first 6 months or the first 12 months, how much revenue has that customer brought in. And part of what makes LTV so difficult, though, is if you say it's the true lifetime, you may not know for several years how valuable that customer is, especially if you have high retention. So there's some ways you can look at the retention rate and estimate your LTV based on how many customers are churning over what period of time. And I think there's some if you Google that, you can kind of see some formulas about how to do that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be exact. I guess that's part of it. What I like to look at is, can I break even in 6 months, for example? And then everything on top of that is just profit. So that's kind of how I think about LTV. In terms of the K factor or the viral coefficient, at a high level, what that means is just for every new customer who signs up, how many friends are they getting to sign up? So if your K factor is 2, that means one new person gets 2 of their friends on, those 2 people get 4 on, and so on. A K factor of 2 is extremely high. I've rarely seen anything that high. I built a Facebook app once that had a K factor of 1.4, I believe, and it grew from 1 user to 5 million users in 5 weeks. So it doesn't need to be that much greater than 1 to see, exponential growth. And interestingly, with the pandemic right now, what you hear as referred to as R-naught is basically the same thing as the K factor. And so the R-naught of COVID, that being above 1 is what causes it to grow exponentially.
And so do you think it's possible to have an exponential growth or a K factor of over 1 with a paid app? Or if not, what's an example that comes to mind, like, of a SaaS product that does viral growth well, but it is ultimately a paid app?
Yeah, good question. I think the reason it's hard to get a K factor above 1 for a paid product is asking someone to pay for something is a ton of friction.
The most.
And so when we were talking earlier about removing friction, as soon as you ask for a credit card number, that's suddenly a huge amount of friction and you get a lot of drop off, so it's hard to keep your K factor above 1. But I think what can work is if you have a freemium model where you are able to use some parts of the service for free, and then you focus on the viral loop, not including a step where you have to pay, but you can kind of use it for free, invite your friends for free, but then you get some percentage of those free customers to convert to paid. So I think that's where you can have both, where you can have that viral exponential growth, but also get some percentage of those people to pay.
And do you have a company that comes to mind that you think does an exceptional job of that freemium model from a virality perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. My focus has mostly been in consumer. I know you were asking about SaaS, but just to give you an example from the consumer space, for example, actually at Uber was a paid product, but the way we made it, the viral loop free, was the viral loop was actually give a ride, get a ride. So you could give a free ride to any of your friends who had not yet signed up for Uber. They could claim that free ride, take it, not have to pay for it, and then they could send free rides to their friends. Yeah. So you're removing that payment step from the viral loop, but then once they experience that one time for free, they want to start using it more and they have to pay from then on.
Yeah.
So I think similar things could apply in B2B and SaaS, spaces.
And I see that everywhere now, Ed. Like, I see that DoorDash has that, like, give and get sort of model. Airbnb has the give and get. And so, that, and similarly, like, another famous example was PayPal, right? Like, for every person that signed up, I think they got $10 or something. But yeah,
when you send people free money, that goes viral.
Yeah, that's the ultimate viral loop. So right. That takes millions and millions of dollars. So, like, what is your opinion on, like, the Zapier model, right? And they just got a $5 billion valuation. They took very, very little kind of investment from friends and families. They grew profitably, right? Versus, like, the DoorDash or the Facebook or the whatever method where you're raising tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to kind of explode growth, but of course giving up equity and having a boss, so to speak. What are your opinions on kind of the two differential models?
Sure, I think both can work, but I have to say, Uber went through many years where we were not profitable, and we were spending a lot of money to grow. And it's a little bit scary when you're doing that because you got to, keep raising more money and keep growing. But I think if you're working on something where the TAM or total addressable market is big enough, investors out there are willing to make those bets and willing to invest even if you're losing money for a while, because ultimately it's such a huge opportunity. That said, if I were to do my own startup today, I would probably try to figure out a way to be profitable from day one, if possible, because I just think that's a more sustainable way to grow, and it's also nice to not have to rely on constantly fundraising and all the dilution that comes as a result.
Yeah, and so last two questions. So
Sure.
how do you actually go about like calculating that? Like when if I'm an investor in Uber and Uber's losing gobs of money, right? How do I feel comfortable, or how do I value my investment when the company's not ultimately making money? Do you kind of understand my question? Because like, how do you have that confidence as an investor? What are the calculations? What's the math where you can evaluate a user with like a non-mature company?
Sure, I think it's not a simple question to answer, but I guess at a high level, I'll share like what happened at Uber was when Uber was smaller, the marketplace was not as efficient because there weren't as many riders and drivers in a given city. So drivers were not doing as many trips per hour, and as a result, they couldn't make as much money per hour unless Uber subsidized them, for example.
Right.
And so I think what happened in that case is investors and employees at Uber believed as we keep growing, the marketplace will become more and more efficient, and we will ultimately get to a point where the unit economics are profitable because it just becomes more and more efficient. So you no longer have to subsidize drivers or give discounts to riders. So I think if you can kind of, short way of saying this is, if you look towards the future and say, if we get to this scale, we will be profitable. We aren't today, but I see a clear path to, at a certain scale, suddenly it does become profitable. I think that's how you get comfortable.
Yeah.
Kind of spending money today.
And just having like the network effects that are basically impossible for anybody to catch. Like when you have all the users, you expand those users into food and like parcel and like all these different things, right? I mean, you can monetize just by having users these days. So I think like just having the growth factors alone are interesting. So the last question. Yeah, the last question I'll ask is, and we ask everyone this because we have a lot of young listeners, we have a lot of 20-year-olds who are just getting out of college. If you could go back and you could talk to 18-year-old Ed, what would you tell him?
Oh, good question. I think I would say, I didn't move out to Silicon Valley until 5 years after I graduated from college. I know in this post-pandemic world, people are saying maybe Silicon Valley is no longer what it used to be, but I think I would have said, move out there immediately after graduating, go work for any startup that is really exciting and working on something big and exciting, and just go to learn. Don't worry about, take like whatever role they'll give you, but just go to a company you're excited about and where you can learn a lot. That's all that really matters. I think if I had to do it over again, that's probably what I'd do.
I love it. It's crazy. It sucks because I have to have another podcast in like 2 minutes. I want to keep talking to you like forever. But if people want to learn more about you, or if you do things like that, where can people learn more about you or reach out to you if you like that?
Sure. Probably the easiest would be Instagram. I'm just uber.ed.baker.
Awesome.
I mostly share stuff about my triathlon training on there, but
yeah.
Sometimes some business related stuff too.
And I can like see like it looks like a one of the like running machines. I forget what it's called, a treadmill, right there.
Woodbine treadmill, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, thank you so much, Ed. Seriously, you're an awesome guy. And if the people demand it, like a year from now, would you be open to a round 2?
Of course.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I enjoyed it, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming, brother. We'll talk to you soon. Click it. Come on, click it. Do it. Click the playlist. Okay, you don't have to, but I promise you'll like it. Click the playlist. See you soon. Peace.